Hey everybody, before we get into the show, one quick thing. Next week's episode is a mailbag, and I would love to hear from you. So, if you have a question for Post Games, preferably reflecting on 2025 or looking forward to 2026, though really you can ask anything about video games, send it to postgamesmailbag@gmail.com. That's all one word, postgamesmailbag. You'll want to send an audio note. You don't need fancy gear, though if you have it, that's fine. You can go ahead and send me a WAV file. But for most people, just go to the voice memo section in your smartphone, record a message, try to keep it between 1 to 3 minutes, and make sure it's a question, and then send it to me, again, at postgamesmailbag@gmail.com. I look forward to answering your questions next week, and I hope you enjoy listening to this episode this week. Hello, and welcome to Post Games, a podcast about why and how we love video games. I am your host, Chris Plant, and I am so happy to have you here this very special evening. The lights, they are dimming, the orchestra tuning their instruments, and the nominees, they're clenching their speeches in anxious anticipation that they might well thank their friends and loved ones for the game of the year. Yes, friends, that is right. With the power of imagination, we have traveled to the Game Awards, the topic of today's show. I believe, and maybe this is a little bit controversial, that gaming's biggest night should, if not be outright respected, then at least taken seriously. Because, it feels good to say things like awards don't matter, or that sales don't matter, that people only do this sort of stuff for the art. But that's only true for those lucky artists who have financial stability and usually really rich parents. For most of us, it all matters. Money funds art. Art justifies the existence of awards. Awards inspire people and investors to spend money, and we repeat and repeat and repeat. Now, if that bums you out, which I get it, take solace in knowing this uncomfortable blend of art, commerce, and competition. It connects us to artists, audience, and critics throughout human history. From the singing and dancing contest of the Dionysian festivals in ancient Greece, to the poetry contest in China, to the Norse poetry contest held by skalds, to the 15th century Spanish troubadours, and to the 18th century British painting competitions. Now, it might seem really silly to list the great contest of human history and then pivot to today's topic, the Game Awards. But remember that Dionysus of the Dionysian festivals was praised for her ability to beat any challengers in drinking contest, including, I might add, Hercules, who could slay practically every monster but got knocked on his ass by a barrel of wine. The Game Awards isn't the Oscars. It's not the Tonys. It's barely the MTV Music Video Awards in terms of hanging out on that same cultural status. But even if the show is still a bit embarrassing and largely serves as advertisements for future games, it does matter to big game publishers and tiny developers alike, because both nominees stand to not only get a healthy dose of public praise, but a burst of press and a spike in sales, especially if they win. With more games released in 2025 than any other year, awareness is invaluable. And the Game Awards claimed a 2024 audience of 154 million streams, which would mean more people watched it than the Super Bowl. And even if that number is only half real, it remains one of the most widely seen annual broadcasts in the world. Today on Post Games, taking the Game Awards seriously. My guest is the only dedicated beat writer on the Game Awards, Ollie Welsh from Polygon.com. Act 1, the history of the Game Awards. Act 2, the secrets of the Game Awards and how they work. Patreon bonus, what the Game Awards got right and what they have gotten very, very wrong. And of course, Act 3, the news of the week. Chatting with Ollie was one of my favorite parts of the job at Polygon, and it was a blast catching up with him. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. So, let's get to it. Act 1, the history of the Game Awards. For 14 years, today's guest, Ollie Welsh, served a variety of editorial roles at the prestigious UK-based online gaming publication, Eurogamer. He would, over that period, help to grow the publication into one of the most influential games media outlets on the planet. The team producing some of the best criticism, reporting, and analysis all under a single roof. In 2022, Ollie left his role as Eurogamer's editor-in-chief to return to writing more analysis and criticism in his current role as Senior Editor UK at Polygon. Ollie is the only journalist dedicated year-round to reporting on the Game Awards, its policies, its machinations, its horse race. Through his reporting and analysis, he has spotted the hidden trends that influence the outcomes of gaming's most influential award. With over 20 years of experience reporting on the industry, Ollie is one of the most knowledgeable people working in games media today, and I am so happy to have him as my guest. It is a new year and you want to eat better, but you still have no time to work with. You have no energy. You have so much going on in your life. Oh, what do? You do Factor. 2 minutes, real food, and you are done. You're not failing at eating healthy. You're failing at having 3 extra hours in every night. You're failing at not being a chef and wanting to do cleanup. Factor takes care of that. It has delicious food that is good for you. You got lean proteins, colorful veggies, whole food ingredients, and none of the yucky stuff, no refined sugars, no artificial sweeteners. It will offer you whatever you need to match your lifestyle. For me, Mediterranean diet, it really works well. But maybe you need something else, like a high-protein diet or GLP-1 support or ready-to-eat salads. Whatever it is, Factor wants to meet you on your page. Always fresh, never frozen, and like I said, ready in 2 minutes with no prep, no cleanup, just chill. I use Factor. I think that you should too. Head to factormeals.com/postgames, 50 off, and use code postgames50 off to get 50% off your first Factor box, plus free breakfast for a year. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscriptions purchase. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. I would put the earliest version of the Game Awards, the amoeba state, washing around in the bile of the games industry, in 2003 with the Spike Video Game Awards. Can you tell folks about what the earliest version of this show looked like?
Now, I can do my best. In a sense, you would probably be better placed to know than me because I'm from London, and if it had a network distribution over here, it was not a network that I had. And it was this strange sort of event that we would receive in little blurry clips in the internet and think, what are those guys doing over there? But of course, I've become familiar with it over time. It was very different from what the Game Awards is now. It's actually something a bit more like what you traditionally think of as an award show, which is to say it was a TV show. It was on a Spike TV network, and it was entertainment. It had celebrity hosts, it had music performances, it had skits, it had sponsorships. It was, in a way, slicker because it was TV, and in a way, much more embarrassing because it was 2003 on a network that called itself the first network for men and was jumping on the video games bandwagon as a way to appeal to young men and their basest instincts. So it was as cringeworthy as that suggests.
What is kind of like a memorable moment from the Spike VGAs?
So there's a few. I think in 2004, there was a segment called Hot Girls Read Cheat Codes, which I think tells you a lot of what you need to know. The same year, they lowered Victoria's Secret models dressed as angels on either side of Snoop Dogg on wires. And in 2007, the Game of the Year nominees were announced by female models coming onto the stage, entirely body painted as games such as Simpsons Hit and Run. It was a misogynist spectacle, basically. And other stuff like, on one year, they had an actor come on and teabag anybody who went over their acceptance speech time, for example. It was pretty grotesque stuff. But if you want to get a sense of what it was like, I think it's the 2004 show. There's extensive amounts of it available to watch on YouTube. But even better, hunt down our former colleague Maddie Meyer's write-up of that, which she published on Polygon, I think, last year. And that will give you a full impression.
Yeah, I'll include that in the show notes. So Jeff Keighley, from what I understand, is part of the show from the beginning, but not the head of the show. Well, I know that he was doing Game Trailers TV, but like, how does he become involved?
He was a producer. I think he was their inside man from video games. He'd been actually involved in a show called Cybermania, but as far back as 1994, when he was a teenager, writing scripts. So like, video game awards are in Jeff's blood, make no doubt about it. Like, this is formative stuff for him.
Now, people might hear that and be like, oh, so is he 1 billion years old and it's a picture of Dorian Gray? How old is he when he's making a show?
I think he was like 16 or 17 at that time in 94. So he must be, in his late 40s now? But so he was a producer on the VGAs, not the TV producer, obviously, of the whole event. I think he produced the awards. He was the contact with the video game industry. And over time, he became like a public face of the awards. He'd be the guy that people would interview about it. There was a famous incident in 2010 when a YouTuber called Angry Joe had a series of very combative interviews with him about, I'm not even sure what they were about. I think he was angry about there not being an MMO award or something. So that shows that by 2010, he was the guy. And he would occasionally appear on stage, but he wasn't the host. They had much more famous people hosting the awards while it was the Spike Video Game Awards. You had people like Sam Jackson or Jack Black, Snoop Dogg, genuinely famous celebrities would present these awards.
Welcome to the 2005 Video Game Awards. It is so great to be here tonight celebrating video games. That's right, video games. The thing that is killing your brain cells and ruining society has its own damn award show. Spike is badass, man. I heard next week they're doing cigarettes and liquor awards.
And Jeff was the power behind the throne. He was more of an eminence grise at that time.
And when does that begin to change? Because I know the VGAs end around 2012, 2013. And then there's a thing called VGX, which I understand it to be the turning point between the Spike era and the Game Awards we know today.
Yeah. So it's still Spike, but they are pulling back from the whole thing. And it does act as a transition. Jeff co-hosts it with Joel McHale. They strip back on all the celebrity stuff and all the entertainment aspects of the show. And it's much more about interviewing developers on stage, previewing upcoming games, which are, would be features of the Game Awards to come the following year. But the kinks haven't been worked out yet. And it is, by all accounts, an extremely awkward viewing experience. Plus, the Spike audience was like, where are my body-painted models? Where's Snoop Dogg? I don't understand this. Who are these boring men talking about making their video games?
I think the Joel McHale might really surprise people, but you went to E3 during the Joel McHale run.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit of Joel McHale's, like why he would be picked for this?
Was it Ubisoft? I think it was Ubisoft, right? He used to MC Ubisoft's E3 press conferences. I think it was at that time when everybody thought the snarky sense of humor was very much part of the gamer aesthetic. And so he used to stride out on stage and sort of slightly sarcastically distance himself from what was going on.
Welcome to the first ever VGX. I'm Joel McHale, and we're coming to you live from LA's beautiful Garment District. I'm an actual gamer. Yes, I know the difference between Miss Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man. One of them is his mom. I'm not sure which. I'm thrilled to be here, mostly because I'm really, really good at scoring free stuff from developers. I'm joined by my dear, dear friend, Jeff Keighley, who I met for the first time 5 minutes ago. Also, due to a loophole in my contract, I will not be permitted to take bathroom breaks. So like many of you at home, I am wearing a super absorbent adult diaper.
But that seemed to be what people wanted, or what people thought people wanted at that time.
I find it very interesting that switch from the Spike era, which like is like David Spade actively hating video games, to the Joel McHale middle ground where it's like, I'm really happy to have this paycheck. I might even like a video game, but you'll never know. Mm-hmm. And then
right.
to where we are now, can you describe what differentiates the Game Awards from all of this other stuff? What is the big break between them?
The Game Awards is a complete shift. I think if you watch the first edition of the Game Awards in 2014, I was scrubbing through it earlier today and I happened upon a quote from Jeff. He's introducing what the show's going to be like, and he says, this will be a little bit like E3, a little bit like an awards show, a lot about celebrating games. And this is the Game Awards encapsulated in a single quote. So he's taking a lot from E3. People just want to see a ton of trailers for upcoming games. They want to get really hyped about what's coming next. We're going to serve that to them. He's doing the awards, is still the peg for it all. And his mission statement is to be a booster for the games industry and to embody that personally as the host of the awards, which he has been ever since.
Well, now this is real. What happens when you get two critics and reporters in a room together? I'm going to now throw a quote back at you. I was reading this 2022 profile of Jeff Keighley and the Game Awards on The Ringer, and Kotaku's Ethan Gatch was interviewed for it. It made a really interesting comparison between the award show and what Keighley is doing, his overall project, with the ESA. And in the quote, he says, as that organization has waned over the last decade, he, Jeff, has come into prominence more as a human face with a very similar project. He's obviously not lobbying Congress, people to try and create laws that are helpful or amenable to copyright interest, labor interest, or whatever, also studios. But in terms of trying to make people proud of the industry and think positively about gaming, he's become the front man for all of that. I think that's a really useful quote if you know what the ESA is and what it does.
Right.
But I was hoping that we could go a little bit deeper into that, of kind of a power play almost that Jeff Keighley and the Game Awards and all of those other things that he does have played against the ESA, or maybe filling a void of the ESA.
A bit of both. I think Jeff worked with the ESA for a long time. He was an intrinsic part of the E3 operation. He hosted the sort of show floor live show that they did. So the ESA is the trade body in the United States of America for the video game industry. It's a lobbying group, but the most important thing it did for the industry was to host E3. And this is a globally significant event. It was the focus of the entire promotional year for video games. It was massively exciting for fans. And I think if you attended E3 as we did at its height, it really was an amazingly huge event. Like, you had these big spectacles put on by all the platform holders. You had this huge show taking over a whole conference center. You had thousands of people from across the industry in attendance. But it was COVID that killed E3, but it was already on the ropes. The big publishers had started to drift away. They were finding that they had an easier way to get directly to the audience through streaming and through their own events, pioneered by Nintendo Direct. And they were beginning to question the value of the enormous expense of this event. And so the ESA was rapidly losing traction. And this is the same time that the Game Awards is on the up, for the precisely same reasons, which is that it's using streaming to talk directly to fans without any intermediary, without them feeling that they're missing some giant jamboree on the other side of the world. So he is perfectly positioned, as E3 is suffering its death throes, to use the Game Awards as his platform, and he has used it to launch Summer Game Fest, which is a direct competition for E3, which has now replaced it in the summer months and now gives him two beats in the calendar year. What he hasn't been able to do quite is bring the big three back under a single tent, or the biggest publishers. They still have their own showcases. They don't necessarily need him anymore. And so he is a much more personal focal point, obviously, than a lobbying group for industry is. And it makes more sense as a public-facing booster for the industry. But whilst he is hugely influential, I don't think he's going to be able to put together anything quite like what E3 was. I think the Game Awards has probably a better chance of becoming that than Summer Game Fest does.
It's so complicated because we'll be chatting with the head of the ESA next year for an episode. Mm-hmm. But a thing that I wonder about is E3 funded the ESA. E3 was not secretly it was the means of rallying the funds to then do the lobbying. The Game Awards that's not where the money's going. It is a private function, right? Like the money goes to the people who make the Game Awards. So it is interesting, to say the least, to see one kind of usurp the other. I do want to get into that, taking advantage of the moment and taking advantage of that shift towards streaming and just going directly to people. When the show was on Spike, it could barely crack 1 million viewers. Its audience was shrinking year over year. Last year, the Game Awards itself said it had an estimated 154 million global live streams. We know, as some people who work on the internet, numbers can be a little funny, but still, I imagine they're over 1 million and probably close to that number. What happens? Do you attribute that growth to being on streaming platforms? Do you attribute it to the show no longer having women in body paint? What accounts for 1 million to 154 million viewer growth?
Yeah, I think those are two factors. Obviously, like the Spike era was very narrowly demographically targeted. This is now just sort of blandly for people who like video games. Obviously, being easily accessible on streaming platforms is huge. I do think, for as much as Spike was embarrassing, it operated as entertainment and was quite entertaining to watch. The Game Awards isn't, but it is offering gamers what they want. It's transposing a recognizable part of gaming culture, which is the E3 press conference, and melding it with the awards show. And I think that makes more sense to the gaming audience than watching a hyperactive, try-hard entertainment show with musical numbers and skits. So I think that's a big part of it. I will say as well, I have a suspicion about that 154 million last year as being related to the presence of Black Myth Wukong as a very high profile, this big first push of the Chinese game industry to present a AAA game and have it challenge at the Game Awards. And I do think there would have been a very large Chinese audience online last year for that specific reason. And so I wouldn't be surprised if those numbers come down again a bit this year. There's no denying the overall trend, which is stratospheric growth. And that comes from the trailers first.
Let's dig into the trailers, because that is where a lot of the, I guess, ethics or conspiracy stuff comes in. And I hate to do ethics in games journalism, please, for all that's holy. But what can seem confusing to people is, where are the barriers between these three core pillars? There are awards, there are official announcements, and then there are advertisements. And they can look very similar. All three really can look quite similar.
Yeah.
What is the difference, and who is paying for what?
So, I mean, I wouldn't know how to distinguish between the official reveals and the advertisements. They're all paid for. The official reveals and just a single trailer drop reportedly would set a publisher or developer back something in six figures, sort of low to mid. So it's a lot of money, right? And probably more if you want to have your developers stroll out on stage and have a big moment around your trailer. Although I'm sure some sort of show concerns come into play with that. They want those to be big games that they're excited about too. But it is all paid for. The awards are not. It would be easy to be skeptical about that. The Game Awards has an advisory board, which is composed of figures from important companies, publishers, Valve, Nintendo. everyone who you'd expect. But the Game Awards says that this advisory board doesn't find out the results of the awards until the public does. And we'll get into the voting setup, I would imagine, in a bit. But the majority of voters are game journalists. That means that journalists have a level of visibility on the voting process that they don't actually have on other awards. And I suspect that if there was interference, it would be readily apparent. So to what degree that gives you a level of trust, I don't know. But there we have it.
I mean, we've both done the voting. We've gone through the process. I agree that I don't think that there is any foul play. I do wonder how the show, or Jeff in particular, avoids the perception of propriety. And I think maybe the most famous incident of this is It Takes Two, very small, technically indie-made game published by a major publisher, wins Game of the Year after its creator becomes something of a character in the Game Awards canon. And yeah, I mean, do you think that is just the nature of an award show, that over time it earns its credibility?
I think so. I can get into the It Takes Two year. It's a weird year. It will come up again. But I think it earns credibility over time. I think it is building it now, but we're 10 years in. I mean, over 20 if we're counting Spike. And it's taken a long time. And I think these are a lot of the reasons why. All awards shows are suspect, right? The Golden Globes has been bought by the company that publishes all of the Hollywood trade publications, whose main source of advertising revenue is for your consideration advertising for awards. It's just a completely closed loop. And similarly, Jeff is up there on stage presenting the awards. He is financially invested in the awards. He owns the company. He receives money. The company receives money from the advertisers to feature their games, which will come out the following year and hopefully be nominated for and win awards. But it's a particularly close relationship. But all award shows are, to some degree, by this, and they're all part of a marketing business at the end of the day, however well-intentioned they are. So I don't think
It's not so unusual.
No, right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I do think it's taken longer for the Game Awards to achieve legitimacy, despite being, to all intents and purposes, pretty well run as an awards show. And I think this is the reason why.
Yeah. One more question before we get into the awards themselves, but I do want to touch on Keighley one more time. Really to look at how his reputation in games culture has evolved between, let's say, 2008, when he's really starting to appear in this, and 2025. I feel like there are eras of Jeff Keighley. Because he is so closely tied to the awards, it's almost like his reputation has evolved with them. So could you just briefly walk us through some of that?
I could. My main observation, though, is I feel like it's been remarkably static. Jeff is Jeff. He is what we always understood him to be. I mean, he was, I think, maybe in 2008, you would still call him a journalist, and nobody would do that now. He was still those long and very good making of pieces with Valve, for example. But his stature has increased. His responsibility has increased, and that's caused some issues when he's had to step out in front of problems such as representation at the show, the number of women on stage, which was a topic of conversation over the last few years, or recently with the Game Awards Future Class members wanting to use the platform to make a statement of support for Gaza, and the awards having to distance themselves from that. That becomes a very personal thing. It becomes tied to Jeff. So definitely put himself at risk to a degree by putting himself front and center as the host of the show as well as its proprietor. There's nowhere to hide for him. And so, yeah, his reputation will go up and down. But to me, he has always been quite clear what he wanted to do. And the one thing I will say is, I think his sincerity is a little bit underrated. At last year's awards, he presented a trailer for Okami 2, and he was crying as he introduced it. And that is, I sincerely believe how much he cares about being able to show the world. I honestly believe he was that moved by it. And I think that's how much he cares about showcasing the art of video games. So not to let him completely off the hook at all, I think there's a sincerity to what he's doing that is cheesy for sure, but is real.
Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the awards. Act 2, The Secrets of the Game Awards, or looking behind the curtain at how the Game Awards actually work. We are back. We've talked about this very briefly, but who votes on the Game Awards?
Okay, so it is voted mostly by traditional gaming publications, such as Polygon or IGN or Eurogamer. There are a few influencers, not that many, and there's some mainstream media as well, like The Guardian or the LA Times. And they're invited to submit their votes, and they submit them not as individual people, but as organizations. So within each organization, depending on how many people are there and how they run their own internal processes, it's intended to be, anyway, from the game point of view, a collective opinion that they formed from all of their diverse points of view. In 2014, when the game started, there were 28 publications contributing. Last year, there were 134. So it's a big voting body. But I say that, compared to an industry voting body that might contribute to something like the Oscars, that could be thousands, tens of thousands of people. So in that sense, it's actually pretty small. But it is critics, basically. It's a broader definition than that. It's media, but really it's video game critics, and a pretty traditional definition of who you think of video game reviewers are. It's deciding these awards. But that's not the whole story, because it is a blended vote. So there is also a 10% contribution of public voting to the awards. So it's 90% the jury, 10% public voting. The nominations is 100% the jury. And then once the nominations are out, the public can vote on them too. I'm not sure what purpose this serves. I can't imagine it changes the results a huge deal. It would have to be a pretty tight race in any category for it to change the winner, I would think, that extra 10%. It feels like it's probably more a play for people to get excited and feel engaged in the awards. There is one 100% voted award, which is the People's Choice Award. So that's who contributes. In terms of the composition of the jury, it is now very international. I've run some numbers on this for my own research, and I found that it was 32% English language publications. So that's US, UK, Australia, Canada. 33% Europe, 28% East and Southeast Asia, 15% Latin America, and 9% rest of the world, Africa, Middle East, South Asia. So it's a genuinely international jury. This wasn't always the case, but right now it is. And whilst there are obviously many more American publications than from any other country, an outsized representation for the UK as well, the overall spread, I was surprised to see like 33% European, non-English speaking European countries, for example. That's a sizable voting bloc.
I remember you spotting this a year or two ago when you were ramping up your reporting on the Game Awards and kind of the horse racing of it all. And it felt like the third eye opening of why certain things win and lose. Can you tell people a little bit about why this huge international block matters in terms of deciding what not just will win the Game of the Year, but what might even get nominated versus what might not, and why, say, for example, certain indie games might not get nominated that you think would?
So there's a specific issue with indie games, which is localization. Like Blueprints, for example, is a game which, even if it could afford to be localized into many different languages, couldn't be because parts of the gameplay are literally about wordplay in the English language. But there are many other games that can't afford to get localized into many different languages, and some of those games might be very story-driven, and that might be a big problem for them. That said, I would say probably a reasonable chunk of that voting body is conversant enough in English to get by playing games in English. So it definitely hurts indie games with smaller budgets. But I think perhaps a more significant effect is it has the opposite effect in games as the recent expansion of the Academy to be more international does for the Oscars in film. That has diversified the taste of the Academy and has resulted in more international movies and more art house movies competing at the Oscars. The opposite thing is happening in games because it feels like it's just reduced us even more to the common denominators, the big games that are going to penetrate into every market, that are going to do well with critics in every area. It's hard for cultural specificity to break through. Sort of blockbusters that are also critically acclaimed that everybody can unanimously rally around, and it flattens the taste of the awards jury. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to have an international jury. I think it's very good. I think it's representative of the whole of gaming, but it does present the awards with a challenge in terms of getting to the cutting edge of taste.
Yeah, there are so many challenges of how you do a Game Awards show versus a film one, and the scale of games. Categorization has long been the challenge that I think gets under people's skin. Why is it so difficult to divide games by genre or categories when you're trying to give out awards?
Now, the one thing I would say, I think this is true of any art. You see this issue at the Golden Globes when they try to decide between comedy and drama, or at music awards when you're deciding if Beyonce can be nominated for the Country Music Awards. The Oscars tries to avoid it altogether. It has no genre-based awards, but it still has fights over what should go into adapted versus original screenplay. This is just a problem with art. Art resists categorization naturally. Art cross-pollinates naturally. This is as true, if not more true, in video games as anywhere else. But the genre categories are important to the Game Awards, and I understand why, because we don't have lots of famous actors to be able to give out awards to. It's harder to break down craft awards and have people understand them. So we have large generalized categories such as art design rather than specific categories like cinematography, makeup, production. So you need more awards and you need to get more games in there as well. And so the genre categories are, I would understand, an essential way to do it. But of course, they're going to be difficult. I think part of the problem as well is that the guidance the Game Awards offers to the jury is loose. And so the jury is mostly left to decide these things for itself, where to put which game, how to define each genre.
Can you give an example of one of those situations where it's like, where does this game go?
So action versus action adventure is...
Okay. You don't say.
This is a tricky one. Action adventure is a very dominant category at the Game Awards. It's where most of the Game of the Year nominees come from every year. Action is a much more marginalized category. Action is where you'll find typically first-person shooters or like side-scrolling beat-em-ups. Action adventure is where you'd find literally anything from a Mario game to a violent open-world adventure. So that's one of the trickiest areas. And the Game Awards offers some language on something about traversal being an important part of exploring an environment, being an important part of action adventure. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it's something that most of the jury understand sort of intuitively.
They know it when they see it.
Yeah, but like actually defining it is tough. And you do get some pretty strange results.
There are some very peculiar awards. Is there any that stands out to you as deeply unusual?
I mean, not as peculiar as they used to be during the Spike era. And
sure,
you had awards for, what was it? Cyber Vixen of the Year.
A classic. Blood Rain 2 must have won so many times.
She did win. And weirdly, Alex from Half-Life won that award once. Not really a vixen, as I would.
Sure.
Anyway, best military game, best game based on a movie. These were some of the awards that you would get back in the Spike days. These days, it makes a little more sense. Games for Impact is probably the most notorious category. Best independent game always causes debate because it's nearly impossible to define or police what makes an indie game. You can have, like, Baldur's Gate 3 is an indie game, except most people understand it not to be. Dave the Diver, infamously, is not. It's published by a massive publisher, but it looks and plays like an indie game that was made by a small team. Family always strikes me as a really difficult category to define. You basically mean games for kids, right? You are allowed to select a game in both family and another genre, which isn't true of other genre categories. You have to, if you've selected a game in one, then you can't select it in another. But yeah, games for impact is definitely the tricky one.
Why is it controversial?
Well, it's really hard to understand what it means, other than intuitively, which I think most people get it, right? The official description is games for impact recognises a thought-provoking game with a profound pro-social meaning. I mean, we could even just get into what pro-social exactly means. It's like
sure.
pro people, I guess. What I think the award actually is, it's another example of Jeff's boosterism, right? He's like, he wants to create a showcase for games as important art, and perhaps also to create another category where indie games can compete because they are so ghettoized in the Game Awards. But it's sort of, a game that goes, makes you think, I guess. It's good that it's there, but it's also, in a way, kind of insulting because it's, say, giving a special award for a game for actually meaning something or having some human content seems a little... We should be aspiring for that in every category. Even sports and racing games, why not?
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking of ideas that are meant to aspire for good, but don't always land on that mark, you mentioned the future class earlier. Can you explain what the future class era was? Because now it seems like it has come to an end.
The future class era was an attempt to do a sort of 30 under 30 type list for the gaming industry, to pick out promising young individuals from across the industry and offer them networking opportunities and mentorship. So, a worthwhile thing for any prominent gaming organisation like the Game Awards to do. There was a bit of a kerfuffle about it in 2023 because the honorees wished to make a statement about Gaza on stage to use the platform, and the Game Awards appeared not to want to do that. It didn't happen at any rate. Last year, there was no future class. Everybody didn't really know what was going on. This year, we've just found out, it has not been officially announced, but reporting suggests that the initiative is dead. So I think this probably shows you the limits of a commercial enterprise such as the Game Awards to do this kind of industry representation. Like, it just gets too dicey for them. They don't really have the tools to deal with it, and they don't really have the motivation to acquire the tools to deal with that responsibility. So it just quietly goes by the wayside.
I do want to dig into the awards specifically this year because, hey, that's what everybody's here for. They're ready for these hot scoops, these insights that you, as someone who is following the horse race, can provide us. Who are the top contenders for 2025 and why?
There's one. The irony of this year, the irony of this year is that we started the year going, all right, Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to win Game of the Year, so that's it. It's all over. Grand Theft Auto 6 gets delayed. We're like, hooray! The race is blown wide open. This is going to be an exciting, unpredictable year. It's not. Claire Obscure Expedition 33 is going to win Game of the Year and is probably going to win many other awards too. I would say it stands very good chances in score, direction, narrative. It's a dead cert for RPG. It's going to come home with a lot of awards.
Why is that?
So, the Game Awards has a very strong genre bias. There are two genres that typically win. I think 9 out of 11 awards have gone to games that are either action adventures or RPGs. Action adventure is more common, but RPGs, if nominated, are more likely to win. So Clair Obscur is an RPG. It has strong narrative elements, heavily weighted. If you look at the Game of the winners, they're all usually quite story-forward games. They have performance in them more often than not, voice or motion capture performance. Clair Obscur is quite a performance-centric game. They're polished graphically with a commonly understood, nice, long, sort of 3D graphical style. Clair Obscur has that. And of course, for an award voted on by critics, Metacritic and OpenCritic ratings are a very strong indicator of how likely a game is to compete. Now, Clair Obscur reviewed very well. It's got a rating in the 90s. That's pretty much an essential for a Game of the Year winner and will also really help. If you also meet all of these other tick boxes, you get into contention. There's also been an absence of other games that tick those boxes, like the big AAA games of the year, such as Assassin's Creed Shadows or Ghost of Yotei, have not quite hit the same critical bar that Clair Obscur has in the middling 80s, which is in most years not going to do it for Game of the Year.
You mentioned Blueprints as an example of a game that is unlikely to get it for reasons that might be a little invisible to people.
Yeah.
Are there other kind of critical darlings that people would assume are going to be competition that actually aren't?
I mean, always indie games. Like, there's a lot of excitement this year because it looks like we're actually going to have 2 indie game nominees, and that would be the first time ever. But that's because those games are Hollow Knight, Silksong, and Hades 2. You couldn't get higher profile indie games. They're genuine indie games made by small teams, self-published, but made off the back of enormous successes, sequels, very well understood known quantities. A game like Blueprints could get in if it was the only candidate, as Balatro did last year. But Balatro was much more widely played than Blueprints. Blueprints has probably not been played by enough people and has not penetrated the international jury deeply enough as well to get through. So indie games always struggle, but also games in other genres. You will never see a strategy or sim game nominated, never mind win. You rarely see multiplayer games. You never see sports or racing games nominated, or at least not since the early days of Spike. So it's not a particularly great example because its reviews weren't quite as strong as you'd expect. But Mario Kart World, for example, let's say it reviewed a bit better, it knocked it out of the park, 94 Metacritic. It wouldn't even get a nomination and it wouldn't be considered for a win because it's a racing game. And racing games don't win Game of the Year because the jury collectively does not place the same value on that kind of video game as it does on narrative-based action adventures, role-playing games, big, sprawling games that tell a story, that have a lot of content. This is what wins. And Clair Obscur in any other year would be a really exciting sort of left field challenger. But because GTA disappeared, because nobody else was quite ready to fill its shoes, or, you know, everyone had already pushed their games into next year to avoid it, and they're now in trouble. There just isn't the competition. But Clair Obscur, despite being a smaller production from a new studio or an upstart publisher, Kepler Interactive, it happens to tick all the boxes. It looks exactly like a Game of the Year winner, particularly after Baldur's Gate 3 a couple of years ago, again, from an independent outfit. And that gives it as well something that most Game of the Year winners don't, which is like a cool factor to attract the jury to say, oh, I feel like I'm voting for the underdog this time, even though on the prediction market Kalshi, it's currently sitting at 80% likely to win. It is not the underdog.
You mentioned earlier the way that it works in the Golden Globes, where there's these for-your consideration campaigns, and there's an entire cottage industry around people angling to win these awards. Does anything like that exist in games? Are the developers making plays to win these awards?
It is starting to happen, and I mean this year. I think for the last 5 to 10 years, it's become common for publishers to send out codes for games that came out earlier in the year for GOTY consideration, but it wouldn't be specifically for the Game Awards. It would be probably more targeted at getting onto your particular publication's top 50 end of year list, and especially reminding people of games that came out earlier in the year rather than, you know, the big fall releases you reviewed last week. So that's been happening for a while, but this year I'm seeing a big uptick in game directors for games that came out earlier in the year that are out of their PR cycle being fielded for interviews, for example. You can see the Kingdom Come Deliverance guys are on a bit of a press tour at the minute. They're not the only ones. We've been the beneficiaries of this at Polygon. We've been contacting people for stories, unrelated stories recently, and finding it easier to get someone like Nate, the game director at Sucker Punch. It's easier to get them on the phone now than it would have been in the middle of the year. So, yeah, I think it is starting to happen. But no, there's no industry as such. I don't think there's any publicists like particularly making this their entire world. But there have been instances like when you saw the sales spike that Balatro got after its nomination last year and the sales spike that It Takes Two got after its win in 2021, it can move the needle. Maybe less so for a massive AAA production, but it's starting to be something that people want. So I think we're gonna see more of it.
One last question for you. If you could make one change to the Game Awards, what would it be?
Puzzle games. If we have to have genres.
I mean, I was leaning towards body painted men. I thought like you and I could go out. I thought that would be nice, but puzzle games is good.
The change I would like to make, I don't know how to affect it, but I would like the jury to be thinking broader in every category. And I don't just mean indie games versus AAA. There's definitely a problem in indie games breaking through. I think that's going to get better, but like you say, it's baby steps. But ironically, the Baby Steps comes out. I think that I'd love to see the genre walls broken down a bit. I'd love to see more respect played to all kinds of games in the major categories like Game of the Year, but also direction. I'd like to see broader thinking about narrative. I'd like to see broader thinking about art direction and the kind of games that you see there. I would love to see racing games nominated for Game of the Year. Why not? So I think there's just a narrowness of thinking within the jury that I would love to be able to change, but I don't know how you affect that with a single change.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting. Where should people follow your work as it relates to the Game Awards and just you in general?
You can find me on polygon.com. I have a weekly-ish column there called Goatee Watch, where we do lots of awards coverage and other members of the team get involved as well. But we're going to be really busy doing Game Awards stuff around this time of the year. But I also write reviews and analysis of the industry and all sorts of stuff over on Polygon.
Goatee Watch is fantastic. I'll link to it. Not only should you go read all the new stuff, but you can go look at the tag and read like the last year and a half of these pieces. And it's truly a primer on how all of this stuff works. It is great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Welcome to the Patreon bonus section. Y'all know how this works. If you are a Patreon subscriber, I have an extra act with Ollie Welsh, today's guest. We talk about what the Game Awards have gotten right over the years, what they've gotten very, very wrong. We talk about alternatives that you could check out if you want something a little different or a lot of different from the Game Awards, and so much more. It's a great conversation. And if you are not a Patreon subscriber, no worries at all, because we have a News of the Week section that is a little bit different this week, and I think that you will enjoy it. So we'll get right to either of those. Act 3, the News of the Week. This week, the news is more of a PSA. Don't play video games out of obligation. In the coming days and weeks, you will learn about dozens, if not hundreds of games, each described with effusive praise, which, to be clear, is great. Learning about new games, stuff you may have otherwise missed, it's one of the many benefits of having trust in your favorite critics. If you have the time and you have the money, you should consider playing what interests you. Perhaps because it sounds fun, or because it's in a genre that you typically love, or maybe because it's unlike anything you've ever played, but a game that challenges your skills, your ideas, or your comfort levels might sound like a worthwhile experience to you. There are so many reasons to sift through the incoming avalanche of recommendations for new stuff to play. But please, whatever you do, don't feel pressured to play a game out of obligation. One of the most common questions that I have received from listeners over the past 15 years of various podcasts is, I don't think I'd like this new popular or controversial or extra long or notoriously difficult game, but should I play it anyway? And my answer is more or less always the same. If you want to feel uncomfortable, if you're ready to be challenged, and most importantly, if you have the room in your life, sure, trying new things we might not enjoy, is a valuable way of expanding our taste, of discovering the new. But I also will add that if you have other experiences you'd rather prioritize, if you know from past experiences a genre or experience isn't your cup of tea, if you're busy with work or family or the ever-expanding obligations of adulthood, then for all that's holy, free yourself of the pressure of keeping up. There is a delicate balance to be had with loving an art form as busy as video games. On one hand, you could spend years playing nothing but Fortnite or Madden or Minecraft or Terraria, never allowing yourself space to discover other potentially richer and more rewarding experiences. On the other end, though, there's the hedonic treadmill of pursuing the new, in which some of us must constantly be chasing the high of the novel, only to discover that when we finally get our hands around something new, it loses its spark, and we're on to looking for that next surge of the unfamiliar. And so, I encourage everyone, wherever they might be on that long spectrum, to routinely take a moment to ask themselves why they play what they play. Are we playing that latest indie game for ourselves or for social media discourse? Are we grinding levels in Fortnite because it's fun, or because we feel an inexplicable pressure to hit level cap before the end of a season and to collect a reward that'll immediately get shelved in our digital storage room? Games can provide a decadent escape or a safe space to expose ourselves to what makes us uncomfortable. They can cement our beliefs or smash them with a hammer, they can heal us, and they can harm us. They are immensely powerful, even when, I would say especially when, they become a thing we do without wondering why. So, this Game of the Year season, as you reflect on what you played in 2025 and field countless recommendations, take a breath and ask yourself, what do you want from your video games? What you play next should provide. We have demystified the Game Awards. It turns out they're a lot like, all the other awards, just about video games with a little bit more sordid of a history. Anyway, feels good to be here. Now we just have to watch and find out who wins. Next week, how anime and video games fell in love. Over the last 30 years, anime and manga have grown from a niche and nerdy interest to claiming the #1 spot at the box office, the most popular section at your local bookstore, and proving themselves to be one of the few growing corners of television and comic books. Of course, if you love video games, the rise of anime isn't surprising to you. Games and anime have influenced and elevated one another, rising in popularity almost in tandem. So how did these hobbies become best buds, and where does that relationship go from here? My guest is Jeff Thu, the host of Mother's Basement on YouTube. He will answer all our questions, including, who is best girl? A reminder, post-game supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got an entire extra act with Ollie Welsh looking back on the Game Awards' biggest whiffs and the things that they really got right, plus some more behind-the-scenes details about how the Game Awards actually work. If you're listening to this on the free feed right now, an entire new episode went live on Patreon, a monthly bonus that is the history of Pokemon, specifically the 20 or so years leading to its release and the moment that it came to the United States. It is a great episode. My guest is Brendan Bigley from Into the Aether and Wavelengths and many other podcasts. I think you'll want to check it out. No ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free at post.games and get the show notes. Post Games logo by James Barham, theme by Mark Sparling, and a special thank you to this week's guest, Ollie Welsh. Like the show? Please, please, please leave a review on Apple or Spotify or share the show with a friend. The show really benefits from a quick bit of help. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you next week.